Hello, Miguel. How are you? I think you're muted.
Hello, I'm sorry. I'm fine, thank
Um,
you. I think it is a little bit earlier, right?
Over here, it's 7 p.m. in the evening. I'm in New York.
Oh, okay, okay.
Where are you based, by
In
any
in,
chance?
in Mexico, here,
Oh,
yes, we almost have the same hour, I think. I am at 5 p.m. I don't know.
oh, that's not too bad. Yes, thank you so much for being a panelist or speaker for the event. I think Naomi, did Naomi reach out to you yet? Or I'm not sure. She's not online
No,
yet.
not yet, but I was in a previous session in very early in the morning. I mean, it was for me like 1 a.m. in the morning, but because it was for the Eastern Hemisphere.
Yes,
And,
yes, yeah.
and it was very good. We had like, I don't know, 85 or 80 attendees.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow. That's great.
yeah, yeah.
Sorry, I forgot to announce that my name is pronounced Hi, like hi. So
Hi,
yeah, like hi. Yeah, it's
like
very
hi.
easy. Yeah, it's easy to
Okay,
learn.
okay. And how long have you been in New York? Or,
So I just transferred here. I was in the Bangkok office with the UN, and so I just transferred to the UN Global Compact here in New York about 3 months ago. So
that's great.
yes, yeah. Have you been to our office before in New York?
Just for tourism with my family, you know. It's a whole week of going to the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building and so on.
If you get a chance to come to New York, we can invite you for a meeting or the next global forum. We can have you come to by our office. So if you would like.
Oh, I would love to, but when is going to be?
For the next global forum, I envision it's going to be roughly around the same time. I think actually it might be more of July, but it's still under discussion at the moment. So
Okay, yeah, that's good. That would be great. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, but we can invite you to other occasions as well if you're interested to come to the UN at any times.
Oh yes, you know that we recently uh, published a book with Palgrave, and it was launched in the Lithuanian mission of the United States, I think,
Oh,
there in
fun.
New York. I think it
Okay.
was recently on May 3rd or 30 or something like that.
I think we have some of our colleagues, or let me just double check.
Yeah. Hello,
Good
Sati.
morning, everyone. Good morning, Miguel. Oh, good evening, I should say.
Yes, it's good evening here. And for hi as well.
Hi,
Yeah.
nice to meet you,
Hi.
Swati. My name
Same
is
here.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes. Are you, you're, I assume you're based in Sydney. I see the
Yes.
background.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just we're waiting for the others. I apologize if I have to remain silent. I just have to get all the other speakers in, but feel free to speak among yourselves while I get the other
Yeah, yeah,
panelists.
absolutely.
Yes,
Absolutely.
boy. You know, Swati, I need to talk with you.
Sure.
I need to talk with you in terms of the upcoming election process.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, we can schedule a time.
Yes,
Whenever
please.
it works for
I don't
you.
know if you use WhatsApp or
Yeah. Yeah. I'm on WhatsApp.
so I will share my WhatsApp number with you through the chat in a private message.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Let's see here.
Are you part of that teaching SIG group that was created overnight? Well, for me, overnight. Um,
Which here you go.
Here we are. Okay. All right. I'm just going to add you a new contact.
Hello,
Miguel.
Rob. It's going
Hello.
to be fantastic to share another meeting with you.
Yes, I'm just looking at my schedule because you were not.
A very warm welcome to this third disciplinary breakout session, international business breakout session. And here comes Mikar. There he is. So this session is about approaches for diverse and inclusive classrooms. My name is Naomi Sinkovic. Some of you have already attended 2 of my sessions, so you might be sick of me by now. But those of you who haven't seen any of the recordings or haven't attended the session, I work at Glasgow. I'm an Associate Director of Research, and I'm also affiliated with the Academy of International Business. This is actually one of the connecting points across all the panelists, our affiliation with different components of the Academy of International Business. Miguel Cordova is the incoming chair for the Teaching and Education SIG. Rob van Tulder is an EIB fellow and also a founding member of the Sustainability SIG. Mikhail Lemansky is affiliated with the Central Eastern European chapter. Swati Nagar is on the executive board of EIB Oceania chapter, and Stefan Zagelmeier is affiliated with the EIB UK and Ireland chapter. But I think what connects us even more, in addition to our affiliation with the Academy of International Business, is that we have traveled far and we taught in different institutions, we lived in different countries, and we have seen many cross-cultural and multicultural classrooms. So instead of me listing all of your experiences, I would like to invite you all one by one to just give us a very short background of your cross-cultural classroom experiences. So I will just randomly pick someone. So Stefan, let's start with you.
Okay,
Migration history and experience.
and experience. Well, migration history. I'm initially from Germany, raised and educated in Germany, but then kind of migrated relatively quickly early on during my study program to the UK, and have been moving back and forth between Germany and the UK. I have taught in quite a well, in multicultural classroom in quite diverse contexts. So I've had various appointments in the Netherlands, in Finland, in France, the UK. I've been teaching for 10 years now on the Global MBA program at Alliance Manchester Business School, which is a transnational education program, which has kind of teaching locations literally on 5 continents. And that's literally the experience I have with interacting with a multicultural classroom. Noemi, do you want me to kind of start now directly talking about a particular topic, or is it just kind of...
Not yet. So I would like to go around the room, and so that the audience gets a picture of who has what experience.
Okay, thank
so
you.
So we'll move on to Swati.
Sure. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're based. I'm Swati, and I'd like to thank Noemi again to have me on board with this session. I'm currently based at the University of Sydney, but have lived a majority of my life in New Zealand, and so I count myself a New Zealander. In terms of multicultural experiences, I was born and brought up in India, and my parents decided to migrate to New Zealand many moons ago now. So I'm quite well versed with the impact that migration has on an individual, and not only as a student, but also as an educator. Subsequently, I realized the importance of cultural awareness quite quickly. As far as my teaching or my education experience is concerned, I've taught across a wide array of programs, including bachelor's, master's, and MBA, each attracting a different and diverse range of students representing different experiences, both from life and work. That's me.
Thank you, Swati. Miguel?
Thank you very much, Naomi. Yes, my name is Miguel Cordova, and I'm currently at Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico, but it's just about 2 months from that because I was teaching at Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú for almost 10 years. I am Peruvian, so I recently moved to Mexico from about 2 months ago, I think. And I teaching sessions with students in many countries in different levels at masters and PhD programs, also in undergrads. And these teaching lessons were in countries such as Colombia, Brazil, Peru, of course, Mexico now, Canada, France, and I usually enjoy very much to incorporate innovation in the classroom in different ways. I mean, and I discovered, for instance, when I was lecturing some students in Chile and also in Brazil, I mean, even though those countries belong to the same continent, to the same region, students and also faculty members have completely different points of view about the same topics in terms of management and business education, international business. So it's quite interesting to see how different we are, even if we are geographical neighbors.
Thank you very much. Mikhail?
Hello, everyone, and good morning, good evening. It's great to see all of you here on the panel, as well as my dear friends from PRME. So hello to Farah. It's great to see you again after some years. My name is Michał Lemański. It's an unpronounceable Polish name, so if you can call me Michael, it's absolutely fine. And so hello, Miguel. And I'm Polish. I studied in Poland, in my home country, and in Austria. That is different from Australia. It's a small country in the middle of Europe. So I have experience of both as a student and as a teacher here in the region. So in Austria, Czech Republic, and Poland. And I spent about 10 years also teaching in a campus of University of Nottingham, so a European university located in China, with students also in Singapore. So I have about a decade of teaching experience in multicultural classroom in Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Mikhail. And Rob, last but not least.
No, Mikhail, sorry for that the Dutch won from Poland, but nevertheless, it unites us as well with the same team, the same companies. Now, I come from a small country called the Netherlands, and actually I'm from Amsterdam, and I went to Rotterdam School of Management a long time ago, and that was already a culture shock. Actually, these cities with each other, not only in football, but also in culture, in tradition. I have a 3-decade experience of teaching around the world, in all the continents in the world, from the Philippines to Berkeley, United States, but also to Brazil, Africa, Kenya. In Australia, I taught in Canberra for a while. So it's a rich comparison I can make, also in the classroom, but also in doing the studies, action research together with local communities and the like. Actually, what I will going to say is that culture doesn't really matter that much, but I will come back to that hopefully in a constructive way. Let's see how we can make it work. But cultural differences and diversity is really important. So anyway, love to be here and share my ideas with all of you.
Thank you, Rob. And the reason why I left you last was because I will direct my first question at you, and I thought this would be most convenient. So I would like to again bring up your book, Principles of Sustainable Business. And I know that you have been on a book tour and you have visited many countries, talked about your book, and also many people in many countries in many programs adopted the book. So my question is, based on the feedback and also based on your vast experience, I mean, what are these teachers saying to you? What kind of feedback are they giving you in terms of adaptation? How easy it is to use it in different settings?
Well, as always, now I'm not sure, because we can also make it a little bit more informal. But maybe I start with some slides and then because that gives you the argument that I want to show, but also some examples of how we are doing this, how we're using diversity, cross-culture, but actually the international business perspective to really constructive discussions in class. So let me share this with you because it is maybe relevant also to show you some of the sources. They are open access, they are available. The book is a printed formula, but there is a website and all sorts of other stuff. So, yes. So actually, I started this morning, so I also asked Miguel and others, you saw my presentation, so don't, but still, we still have another audience as well. So let me reiterate what I said this morning. Actually, this is what I call the common challenge. The common challenge is the VUCA world. This is the nice part, or the worst part of what we see today, is the crisis all around. It's man-made, it's complex, and this is what a polar or multipolar world looks like these days. So we don't have the American hegemony anymore. There's competing continents with each other, but also collaborating. So there's an interesting, intricate sort of challenge that we face. And we also face what I would call then common skill challenges. Again, this is what I maybe presented this morning, also referring to some of the skills formulas that we say. This is the World Economic Forum basically saying it's about our students, but our executives, actually, I think we ourselves have to develop analytical thinking, complex problem solving, critical thinking, creative originality, leadership, but not ICT skills as such or any sort of instrumental skills. Now, that is important because that then defines why I think sustainable development goals are so important. And I just refer not to the Principles of Sustainable Business, that's the book Noemi refers to, but the book that I wrote a couple of years before that, that was sort of a little test. It's getting all the motives right, where I then try to include what is called international corporate responsibility, driving to the next level. And in that book, I go into motivation, but motives are, of course, influences by perspectives, by culture, by mindsets and the like. So in that book, I really make that case, which then I develop further also in the classroom together with my students. And actually that book was also one of the sources for in-class discussions and a number of I developed that are now also available on the website. So first state culture doesn't matter in a way, because we have common challenges, we have common skill challenges, and we have a common agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. And in a way, of course, it is something that the universal challenges then depend on to what is poverty or climate, or are they interrelated? And then, of course, the contextualization becomes important, but that not necessarily has to do something with the culture. For instance, then, if you look at the SDG agenda, we see 5 basic principles: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnering. And my experience all around the world is that actually everybody understands that they are universal principles. That's not the issue. The issue is, of course, how to link them to problems, how to use them also in order to solve problems, but also how to engage in class interactions around these common issues. So you can see I turn it around. Other than my very good colleagues also from Poland, Slavik Magala, for instance, who taught cross-cultural management, he starts with cultural differences and then try to figure out how we can then bring it together, which is I always like. But I turn it around and say, what are our common problems? And then, does culture or diversity matter? So this is what I did, and this was what I presented this morning. For instance, one technique is, for instance, a technique that we used. We called it the wicked problems analysis. And in that technique, what we do, we bring together students, and this might not be the best cross-cultural picture of a student population, but I find them in my classroom and then say, okay, try to figure out whether there is anything common in the challenge that you face. And we have a 10 wicked problem scales, but we also have a number of methods, iterative reliability, democratic methods, and whatever. And the nice part there is that in the end, cross-cultural influences make them aware that maybe in another culture, for instance, the problem of poverty is treated completely different than in another culture. For instance, in India, at least what I experienced when I was teaching and I was doing research in India, to a large extent, the culture says poverty is fate. And in my country, we would say, in the liberal country, we would say poverty, well, people are lazy or whatever, of course, in other countries. So what you will see in that conversation, then suddenly you say, well, to what extent what does it mean? What does the problem mean? And then you get beyond the cross-cultural, the cultural biases or the influences, and then you are able then to come to sort of common opinion. And I have done this in many continents also. And the basic story is we can identify the complexity of an issue, even beyond cultures. But of course, if you want to solve it, then the culture, the traditions, the religion, the common understanding, of course, what this culture is really becomes important. However, I also think that institutions then are sometimes more important. And that's, of course, an eternal discussion on whether institutions and culture are the same or to what extent they influence each other. So I just showed this as one of the posters that the students make. And this, you can see the complexity scale. This is actually a poster on zero hunger and then applied to what is it? Ghana, I think, Bangladesh, sorry, I have to look at this. And what you see is this is an international, cross-cultural class where 5 students got together. They identify the wickedness of the problem by then contextualizing. So this is about zero hunger. Contextualize it to the Bengali circumstances. Then they have to understand what that means in terms of trends. And then they're able also, again, to overcome the cross-cultural differences within the classroom by identifying the problems. And then, of course, being much more analytical to what that means also for addressing the issues. This is a learning experience. And actually then the classroom is all about respect, because actually everybody likes to think, to talk to each other and say, how do you? And so we don't look at the solutions, because then we get cultural differences, fights, rivalry, and whatever, of course, what we face at the moment. So it turning around, and that has been one of the most positive experiences I've had in my classroom, also with executives, that actually to a certain extent, we across cultures and we can agree upon things. So the second part is then use the SDG framework to make the problem also identifiable and comparable. So this is the Sustainable Development Report. You can see, for instance, there's a dashboard. Again, this is important because I'm not looking at one issue. So of course, I taught in classes with cross-cultural management also on the topic. And then you say, okay, if you go to Japan, please make sure that your socks are okay or whatever, because then you learn how to deal with the culture. But if you look at that in terms of the problems of Japan, then you see on this with the same dashboard that some of these problems are the same. This is much more sophisticated way of looking at the problems and then identifying what the cultural impact or the institutional context means. So for instance, just to give you an idea, if you go into something that I did a while ago, look at low and middle income countries, compare them, and there's of course lots of discussion there. Compare the challenge of quality education, for instance. You see differences, and some of these differences then can be defined by culture, but probably also most of them are not. They are institutional based. But if you want to go to the solutions, then of course a privatization of education, or the public investment, or the common good. Education is clearly a common good. If we don't serve it well, then there are all sorts of approaches that you can define, and then you can learn also from each other by also checking also on the cross-cultural differences. What we did in the book, and this is the principles of sustainable business, is to the left. We identify then different kind of institutional setup. It's too small to read, and then say, but you can see there are different approaches where the market dominates, or the government dominates, or civil society dominates, or anything in between. And that really influences, and that's the theory that we developed, the way countries or systems, or what I call CSR regimes, influence the way people are looking at solutions. So getting to this, we can define that then in terms of CSR regimes, in terms of national policy statements. By the way, why I like the SDG agenda, I reiterated that this morning, I think already, stick to the SDGs because we have an immense data dividend on comparing countries, on understanding each other, and just have to look at this. go into the databases, then for instance, compare if you are, for instance, a Danish company and you go to other countries. So you have the voluntary national reviewer Denmark, you have then the national reviewer of other countries, and you have all sorts of scores. And actually you can then, what I call a CSR distance, compare it, the home and the host. It's very IB oriented. My students then understand that cultural differences are important. They are important also for management within an organization. But at a certain stage, the IB perspective, that means maybe the organizational culture becomes even more important than the national culture, at least in terms of addressing issues, the discussion between the multi-domestic and the global firm and anything in between. But by addressing this, and I hope you understand, I do that in a cross-cultural classroom, but actually it doesn't matter. People from different cultures bring in different ideas, but they bring in also different ideas because they're older or younger or male or female or whatever. So it's always nice to talk about that. And then, for instance, and this is just another way, I say we look at society, we do different organizational forms, and then you see already that the internationalization of those companies depend upon whether they're a public or a private or a stock quoted company, a family-owned enterprise, a cooperative. Again, this is the organizational culture in a way, but of course that is dependent upon all sorts of historical conditions that might even make the cooperative or the family-owned enterprise comparable in the Netherlands, comparable to the family-owned enterprise in India or in Vietnam or in the United States. So in a way, then the cultural expression of different, that looks like there are many differences, in a way also boils down to, well, maybe it's agency, maybe it's a sort of organizational structure that helps a lot also then to identify, for instance, in this case, the distance between the home and the host countries and the like. So skipping this, basically getting to another technique that we use. So we use posters. We ask our students to look at this. So we ask them to look at organizational form. And this is, for instance, what you can find on the website. You see the triangle, you see different organizational forms. And then we say, to what extent does it matter whether you start as a number 6 organization, which is a public company, stock quoted, and you will find it everywhere in the world, or you start as a family-owned enterprise or as a cooperative or as an NGO. So just give you an example. Just take this one, and then you see that this is a poster of a number of students. So they identify this is the company. I cannot read it, but it's in what is it? Olam. Sorry, it's Acro Food. So they are a public company, 100%, and then we see on the basis of their societal triangulation, as we call it, a particular position in their home base. And from their home base, they internationalize, and they will basically say, okay, what are they looking at? Where are they in the transition? What are they then facing in terms of the international strategy? What are the SDGs that they adopt? And most of these SDGs are universal in a way, but also have to be contextualized. So that's the techniques. Now, the nice part of this is that we can bring our students in the classroom. We ask them to look at Olam, but we then ask them also to contextualize this. And then we overcome the cultural differences as an explanation of things or as a way to fight with each other, but actually to enrich the discussion, but linked to the internationalization strategies of companies, because that really matters. So, and another one, I just picked out one. This is State Grid, which is owned or a semi-state owned Chinese company. So we're a completely different cultural background that you might think. But actually, in this case, also what shows is that the institutional and the organizational and the ownership background, in a way, also for the internationalization, and you can look this on the website, by the way, that influences also the way they organize themselves much more than just looking at the cultural differences between them. That one final remark, on the website, you can also see we turn it around. So the things we did was, let's take then Africa as a continent, then looks at companies, how they're dealing with, for instance, the African context. There's a book, there's open access, you can find it all. And then we make the same kind of maps. And my students, by the way, these are bachelor students. They start with almost no knowledge about Africa. They're from all around the world. Some of them are from Africa, but even the African students don't know much about Africa in a way, because they're expatriates. So they start to learn about the difference between countries. And then, for instance, I ask them, okay, look at a company like the Dutch Flower Group. They are then spreading, or BAM, which is a building company, spreading their activities around Africa. That look at wickedness, they look at partnerships, they look at the SDGs. And then, of course, they try to figure out how cross-cultural differences not only are important for the internationalization, that's old style IB thinking, by the way, context, you have to adapt to the context. But actually what we do then in these two companies, for instance, is can you use the cultural diversity in the organization to also, in this case, not just export to Africa or make use of your competitive position, but actually this, because that is the question we pose to the students, can the companies, when they invest in Africa, also empower the communities, and this is the SDG agenda, contribute to sustainable development? So that is, of course, a leading question that I think really helps to get to use also diversity and cross-cultural differences in your classroom, but link it to the company strategies, which in a way gives a sort of a common framework, which I think it's also why it's so nice to be in a class talking about international business or international political economics, and then apply the SDG framework, which is more or less common. So that is my take on this, Naomi. I hope you don't mind that I took a little bit longer, but it requires some explanation also, how we take that challenge also, not as a negative one or adaptation one, but actually as a very positive one that we can develop proactive strategies.
Thank you, Rob. There is a comment in the chat from Chandrika Farmer, and that also gives me a very good segue into a comment and the question that I will then throw at Mikhail. So Chandrika wrote that in a classroom, students come with their own stereotypes and biases. This could be biases about language, religion, food, region, etc. And that sometimes it's the lens with which they approach issues. Those biases and stereotypes need to be addressed too. So I think, before I let you respond, I think that the formula that you are using in your book works because it is a set formula. However, if we contrast that with the I5 playbook and the way that many educators are using the I5 playbook to define meaning and playfulness and all these kind of dimensions, then they are basically applying a completely different formula, because then they start with a negotiation process about coming to a common understanding of what is meaning. Because if you're using the SDGs, I guess you're taking the process out of the equation. And you say, okay, this is the SDG framework, so that already predefines meaning. And then it's a completely different formula. So just like Annick says in the chat, I like the inverse look to intercultural differences.
Well, listen, Naomi, if you don't mind, I just for a remark. No, because the bias question is really important. And that's why this morning I talked about the skill sheets that I developed, which basically said we need to get an understanding for our students, but even of ourselves, what our biases are. Not because we want to accuse each other of biases, but actually we have to understand what our biases are. I have a whole biases, which are important to put them on the table in order then to also work with them, overcome them, and discuss them. So, but the only way to do that is not to talk about biases and say, well, you're wrong because you have a racial bias, or you have a gender bias, or whatever, but actually, what does it mean when you talk about a common problem you have? What does it mean also, does the bias then intervene in a negative way that you are not looking at the issue itself? So actually it's talking about the scientific mindset. And I question my biases all the time. I have a lot of biases, and I question that with papers when I see there is a selection bias, there is a all sorts of other methodological biases. That applies to cultural biases as well. And whether, and so in a way, I don't mind. I turn it around, and then the bias can be functional as long as you want to talk about it. And if you cannot talk about it, then of course you have a problem.
And maybe I can let Chandrika speak for herself
Yeah.
instead of reading out her messages. Chandrika, please.
Thank you. No, I think I'm just coming from my context where, we do send us like, our 360 students, we ask them to go to rural India. And they come up with, they spend about 5 weeks in that rural India. And then you see them, they have biases in terms of, and as I said, it's part of your lived experience. It's something you carry with you because you're based in a certain location. So you might have, and it comes from on a range of things. It could be about caste, it can be about community, it can be about religion, it can be about food, it can be about a language. India is like 28 states, big enough for several continents. So you see those biases where people from North think that people from South would be totally different and vice versa. So it's about exposure and about addressing those through the exposure where people go and live the different life. And so that becomes an important part of experiencing and then unlearning. It can also be biases about it, like you're working with communities which have certain it could be, just giving a couple of examples, it could be some of this, my students work with leprosy patients or organizations with leprosy patients, or they're working with organizations which are sex workers, and the stereotypes that you have.
Yeah.
And then when you actually engage, I think that process of unlearning what you've grown up with for 25 years or 24 years, that itself, until you address that, you cannot build. The first thing to address is those biases and those stereotypes that we live with.
Thank you very much, Chandrika. So this is where I would like to bring in Michael, because he has his own set of experiences when he was teaching in China. So Michael, what is your perspective? How do you approach teaching sensitive political and cultural topics, for example, in a context where some, in a respectful and meaningful way?
So I think we're always very lucky to work with students because by definition, if you're at the university, it means that you want to challenge yourself, that you want to walk an extra mile, that you're open-minded. So talking to that audience about what we call sensitive topics is I would say we're in a very lucky position, and at the same time, being a foreigner, someone who speaks different, who looks different, who maybe has different habits, or like by any means is the other person, it is great for IB contexts because there's no way around sensitive topics if you're teaching international business. By definition, if you look at any curriculum or any course, you have to touch political, cultural, religion, and similar topics. So things which define people, which set their identity, but at the same time can be used as a line of division. And I think the second point about why I'm feeling lucky teaching international business is, if you're a European and we have this experience on one hand to know the darkest moments in human history, of the world wars, which basically torn down the continent, but at the same time the experience of unity. So I think I normally start the class talking about so-called sensitive topics, but saying that it's absolutely normal, meaning that we're so different, because that is how we navigate the world. So having stereotypes and biases is simply our experience. We build that experience observing the world, and maybe we notice that those people around us who we call parents are not the whole world, and then we look a little bit more around and we traveled and we see different people, and of course, you will never discover that you identify yourself as a, I don't know, person of this particular race or nation, and until you really go out of your village, of your town, or your continent. So I never thought about myself as a white man until I saw someone who doesn't look like me, right? So that is basically IB class or multicultural classroom is very often a mirror in which we discover ourselves. So that's basically I set the ground that, you know, that's basically how it happens. And again, the European experience, I think, you know, is quite a good lesson for all of us here in Europe, of course, and the struggles to keep the unity. And at the same time, a good experience for others to learn. So people are indeed fascinated by the fact that, for example, I say, well, if you look at European Union, you need to look back to the history and understand that it was less than a decade after the World War II ended that both sides, nations on both sides were fighting, and now decided to share the most important resources at the time. So it's a community of steel and coal. So of course, everyone who was in the room setting up European Union must have had family members and friends died in a deadly conflict. And now they are signing an agreement to exchange and share freely the most important strategic resources. And I even go that far and ask my students, for example, can you imagine that we have a union of India and China as one, sharing the most important resources, having free flow of people, free flow of capital. And it's not something obvious for people. Many of them didn't think about it, but it lets them understand what does it mean to unite. For example, what it had to mean for Europeans to unite. Now, technically, I think the most important lessons that I learned myself is to appreciate the context in students who are socialized, or we can say maybe indoctrinated, or simply learned the word. And we learned about individual as well as collective experiences, which shaped the culture of particular society or group which are represented in class. That's not always easy. So for example, if you listen to the news very often, and it's all across all countries and continents, that whoever is in power now would like to present that individuals or ruling party or whoever is in the power at B, maybe is presented as an assault to the society. So if you challenge anything. So instead of maybe instructing the students, I think, I try as a teacher, actually let them discover what we have to learn about the world rather than telling them what we need to learn about the world. And very often telling them that, you don't need to be a fish to know a lot about fish. So learning about others, learning about other problems of others as well, over challenges of others, is simply, you can do it without being a part of this community. And so multicultural classroom is a good platform for exchange. I think ultimately it will be about the needs. We don't need to compromise on our fundamental values, yet we engage in discussions which may lead to more critical perspective on ourselves, on what we achieved in a society, or we achieved in terms of economic development, what happens to our culture during globalization, during exchange, and so on. And yeah, I mean, like you asked me about a few stories. So of course, I can tell a lot of stories of mistakes that I've done and errors. And I still remember, for example, encouraging those big portions of the class assessment given for active class participation. And from our experience, we know that not in every country students are very much used to being active in class. So at Copenhagen Business School, I think if anyone who is teaching there, we know that students are not getting points for active class participation, and students in few schools in Scandinavia may not be very active in class or not very talkative compared to peers from, let's say, Southern European nations, or students in Southeast Asia may not necessarily be so active in our classes, simply because many of them don't want to challenge the teacher or expose them to the danger of losing a face. But being concerned about my student who was very quiet and didn't have a score, I encouraged them so much to participate in the discussion that I never saw that student again in my class. So instead of helping and supporting, I basically did a public execution of a student, which I regret now a decade later and apologize to the student again. But that is the kind of insensitivity, lack of sensitivity that I could have had. Now, we know that also the approach of treating in others is different, but if we look at such experience as, for example, reserving a seat in a library, I learned when visiting Singapore that students were reserving a seat by leaving a credit card on the seat. And of course, it's not an approach that we would see in many other locations.
Oh, did we lose Mika? Okay. Was an interesting story, losing him in the middle of the credit card stories. Unfortunate. Hopefully he will come back. So in the meanwhile, if I may
I
move
think
on.
you lost me for a second, right?
Yes, you are back. Okay, so you're in the middle of your credit card story.
Oh, okay, good. No, I was just saying that, you know, about those differences in student habit. But basically, to summarize, it probably was a good sign that, you know, talking about sensitive topics is might be not always easy. I would say that what I learned is if you set the tone of a class as getting to know each other and encourage the respectful treatment of each, which doesn't mean that we have to agree. And I very often, basically to finish my monologue, I very often give an example at the beginning and say, like, we are all for human rights, right? And of course, everyone, you know, like all the governments signed the Human Rights Convention. And then ask, well, you know, what is the first human right? And, you know, some people have to use the search engine or AI tool, but they find out it's a right to live. And then ask, okay, can we unite? Can we agree on that? Do we know when the life begins, when the protection of human life begins and when it ends? And we immediately see that, you know, the answer is different in different legislations. And there are countries where euthanasia or abortion is allowed to certain extents and others not. And so such fundamental issues as the first human right, the right to live, is even difficult to unite on. So from that perspective, if we basically set the tone and say, well, we're not here to agree on everything, but we are here for education, for judgment, for managerial decision, and we need to understand each other. And learning, for example, from, again, European history, where nations who were in a deadly war can actually exchange the most important strategic resources, are building together this unity, is possible.
Thank you, Mika. So I would like to move on to Swati on the topic of inclusive curriculum design. With all your experience, Swati, what does decolonization mean to you?
That's a very interesting question, Noemi. I think a lot of the course material that we have comes from, say, certain parts of the world, or largely dominated by certain parts of the world, because a lot of the dialogue, a lot of the research, especially in the IB space, started off in those, you know, continents, namely North America or Europe. But what has happened over the last few decades is that the student population has changed significantly in our classrooms, but the course material that, you know, that reflects what we're supposed to teach and how we engage with the students has actually not caught up with that, in my view. And this is where decolonizing not only how we, say, teach our students or our pedagogical innovations matter, but also equally, we need to recognize whether research, the research that we engage with or in as scholars ourselves, whether we're looking at it purely from a research you know, paradigm, or whether we are looking at research from an educator perspective, there needs to be a discussion or at least an acknowledgement that a lot of literature that is available across a wide range of courses that we cover and across a wide range of programs that we teach comes from a very Anglo-Saxon perspective, largely. And that is something that as an educator that I'm really interested in, because like I said, that our classrooms now reflect a wide array of students that come from an international, say, background or different countries. And equally, we have students who come from an indigenous perspective that are part of the local communities. And certainly in New Zealand, I can speak from that perspective, that we had a lot of Maori and Pacifica students, and making them understand certain concepts that were very much, that are very much embedded in the Anglo-Saxon perspective is very difficult or is very challenging, because for them, that worldview does not exist. Right? Or actually training them and asking them, picking up from various conversations that have happened so far, it's almost asking them to unlearn and their own cultural beliefs or their own value systems or their own worldviews to adapt to what the literature tells you to do. And that, I think, is a fundamental issue within the not necessarily just the IB space, but largely in academia, I would say. And that's something that I can go on and on about. But developing assessments, recognizing that everyone has different perspectives, and coming to the, drawing on the point that Miguel, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, rightly mentioned, that we need to acknowledge that people come from different backgrounds and identify a common ground, or a ground that ensures unity in some format within that classroom, because that classroom is the safe zone where people need to feel safe and need to engage with or rather engage in conversations that can be critical, that can be contentious, that can be sensitive.
Thank you very much, Swati. And I think this is, oh, okay, Michael, and then I will jump to Stefan.
Oh, no, sorry, just no, I was very much fascinated by what you say and intrigued. And I was just wondering, because Anglo-Saxon culture is so rich in itself, because it came as a melting pot of so many different cultures. Even if you think about English language, I know it is just composed, it has so many roots. And I was just thinking whether you also think about decolonializing, the curriculum, for example, whether is there any room for discussion that, let's say, Anglo-Saxon colonization was in fact a vehicle to transfer even, for example, a lot of what we think is Western values are actually Mesopotamian, myths, right, which come from the Arab Peninsula, of all those traditions of Babylon, and so on. So it is a rich history which came through this only vehicle, was transferred around the world. And it can be about values, or it can be about even even plants. Like my Indian students, for example, when they learned that the chili actually is a plant original to South America, so it did come through colonialism as well, and now it's enjoyed very much in different cuisines. Would also discover it. So I was wondering if there's any discussion for what are the values of particular country or nation or ethnic group, and what is only the vehicle for transfer of more composite of different values.
So, I mean, from that perspective, my view is that there are two aspects. So, of course, the world is so interconnected due to colonization, due to migration, etc., over the few centuries, not just in the last few decades, but over the few centuries, that there is an element of that melting pot that you rightly mentioned. But equally, individuals represent a community that they come from. And I think in the broader discussion, although as you've rightly said, Miguel, is that from an Anglo-Saxon perspective as well, that perspective represents a wide variety of cultures, wide variety of languages, value systems, etc. But in many ways, it's packaged as one and then sold as this is what the Western world represents. And I mean, as a researcher, as an educator, I understand that's not true, but trying to convince that and convey that in a classroom to a bunch of, first year or second year students, that's very challenging. So when I talk about decolonization, I'm not talking about only decolonizing from Eastern or Western perspective or Eastern versus Western perspective. I think the decolonization needs to happen even in the Anglo-Saxon perspective, because a lot of the values that are deemed as common actually are a result of an amalgamation of people across centuries. It hasn't naturally happened. In some respects, it's forced. In some respects, it's natural. So I think conveying that to a bunch of students that have never traveled overseas, are yet to do their OE, especially from a New Zealand or Australian perspective, it's quite challenging. And to try and convey why this view actually fits in your local community. And that's the other part of the challenge. I don't know if that is something.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much.
No, it's all good.
No, that was a fantastic response for this. Rob's hand is up, and after that, I'm just keen to make sure that Stefan and Miguel get to speak as well. So, Rob.
No, I think the decolonization discussion is really important. However, I feel as a Dutchman also colonized by the Anglo-Saxon whatever way of doing research. Actually, I think most of us that also look at the issues of society, the sustainable issues, feel a pressure for publications. And don't worry, we're 150 plus publications in the articles, but actually I felt extremely limited in my way of expression, which you can then sort of identify as a form of colonization in terms of the scientific method according to the Academy of Management Journal. So 100%. I turned it around. Again, I'm trying to make that point because I had the discussion in South Africa the other day, where again, decolonization then is a sort of against oppression. I'm against oppression, but I'm also against stupid solutions for wicked problems.
Yes.
Or even if you're right, you're suppressed or you have a problem, Black Lives Matter or the Gaza war or whatever, there's clear injustice there, which we have to define also as something that we really feel strong about. So my solution, at least approach to most of this, is what I call triangulation. So triangulation means I'm looking at the issue, I'm trying to look at the problem, and I have 2 types or 3 types of triangulation. Triangulation meanings I'm trying to figure out what are the most relevant theories, what are the most relevant methods, and then I'm one of the what we call heterodox economists, by the way. I'm looking at different diversity in theory, in method, and whatever, and then not biased, not what works immediately. So, and that takes it away from this whole idea of dominance or colonialism. At least that has been my experience. And there, in the end, it's only in terms of science and of teaching. To be honest, there's only good science and bad science, or good teaching and bad teaching. And bad teaching is to maybe use the decolonization issue as an ideological frame against something, which can be very all right. It is for clearly something that there is a dominance of a way of thinking about theoretical issues or practical issues of market economies that I don't like. So the triangulation, actually, you saw that in my presentation. There is a triangle, but then a societal triangle, and that takes away the whole idea of a discussion about you're right or wrong. Actually, what you are better capable of understanding the issue. And I think that breaks through some of these discussions, which I don't find very constructive in a way, although very understandable also from the suppression of different of almost ideological ways of looking at science and at teaching.
Just to add to that, I 100% see where you're coming from, Rob, but my approach is not to actually talk to students about oppression or what is right versus what is wrong. Neither is to preach an ideological, framework, because I, by no stretch of the imagination, am a perfect person. I too have my biases, but my point is more to the fact that you raised earlier, that there needs to be a grander discussion in academic circles, that we're not so much driven by publications that force us to think in a certain format, and therefore our research reflects certain type of literature. That is my, concern, not the fact that I'm talking about, oh my goodness, you were oppressed for a couple of hundred centuries. This is what you need to do.
No, Swati, that's almost a self-imposed colonization of the scientific trait that we have. We created the selection environment, sometimes for good reasons, that is now oppressive, and it's limiting, and we get complaints all around the world also that it doesn't really help even for young scholars to have self-realization in becoming a scholar, or etc. So it's almost psychological there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then on that note, if I may cut in,
Sorry.
2 more speakers, and after that, I'm very happy to continue this debate. So Stefan, I know that you have your views on giving feedback, especially formative feedback in the multicultural classroom, but please feel free to also chip in on the decolonization debate.
Oh, Noemi, I mean, now I can't resist that invitation, really. No, I would like to actually try to find a reconciliatory kind of note here, referring back to what Michal said. IB offering the opportunity and also requiring us to learn more about others. And in that kind of process to learn about ourselves, our own background, about our own families. I was just thinking when Michal and Rob and Swati were kind of contributing to the discussions. Well, what do I know about other kind of people, other countries? So just from my own experience as a German, what do I know about Polish history, for example? What do I know about Dutch history? And when you start kind of investigating that, you actually identify that you know relatively little about your own kind of country, people background. And that's actually quite an important point of also IB. I mean, I was just talking about close proximity. What about different countries, different continents, people in other places, what we call kind of other kind of cultures? And here the interesting bit is that IB provides that opportunity in the multicultural classroom to actually learn about others together with others. And that's what I have in the UK when I have like 100 IB students from whatever 35 countries in the classroom. And that happens even more in a kind of a different context when I teach actually in other countries, when I teach in Arab countries, when I teach in Asia. Because, and this refers now back to Swati's comment about safe space, this is no longer the kind of the safe space that I have as a teacher with a kind of the hierarchy and the status that I have as a kind of a on-site kind of person in Manchester. When I actually discuss issues in Arab countries, in Dubai with Arab students, or in China with Chinese students, it's a completely different situation. We have that opportunity, but it's also associated with a lot of uncertainty, complexity, and a lot of potential issues that emerge. Anyway, there's a lot of food for thought in the previous contributions, and Noemi asked me to actually, well, move away from the big picture, the grand scheme of things, towards something more specific and practical, pedagogical aspects and implications of cross-cultural diversity with respect to kind of teaching methods. And I would like to very, very briefly report on research. I've been involved in pedagogical research on designing effective formative feedback systems in the multicultural classroom. That's a project that I initially started off focusing only on formative feedback systems. I stumbled into that kind of research area. In my earlier life, I was professor of human resource management, so performance management seemed to be close to home. And then when I kind of continued working on the design of formative feedback systems in a pedagogical context, I figured out that most of the research of the work is on formative feedback as such, but it's actually largely ignoring cross-cultural aspects. And I took an inspiration from a recent literature review published in the Teaching in Higher Education journal, a very reputable journal in 2023, which was actually engaging with the implications of cross-cultural diversity on the design of formative feedback systems. Just briefly, formative feedback systems, formative assessment, formative feedback is very much on the rise. Many universities in the UK in particular, but I guess it's the same in other countries, are increasingly emphasizing the importance of formative feedback in the teaching and learning process. Formative feedback is about giving students feedback about their understanding, skills development in order to help them improve their performance in the learning process. It has a couple of functions. It supports student learning, it's motivating to students, and it supports them in their personal development. When it comes to the design of formative feedback systems, you find usually in the literature toolboxes of what you should consider the student's perspective. For example, you should consider different options for providing formative feedback. You should look at institutional perspective, at the teacher's perspective. Overall, empirical research on the topic is relatively underdeveloped at best. And what is even further or even more underdeveloped is actually the research on formative feedback in the multicultural classroom. The little research that exists out there mentions a couple of challenges of providing formative feedback in the multicultural classroom, and that relates to kind of points that have been mentioned before, in particular cultural differences, which may impact feedback perception. And feedback perception is very much related to the ways that feedback is actually communicated. So in those kind of multicultural, and this relates to multicultural communication as we have it in the IB textbooks literally, is about differences in perception, differences in taking on information, processing information, and drawing conclusions based on that information. And there we have evidence that different students from different cultural backgrounds, and I need to choose my words here very, very carefully when I refer to cultural backgrounds. I'm very much critical of reducing that to national cultures. I think it's much more diverse when you look at different cultural fairs, but IB unfortunately is focusing still very much on national cultures. So that influences perceptual processes, that influences the perception and the functioning of communication. But there's also kind of an emotional component, an affective component of providing formative feedback. And I think Michael kind of mentioned that nicely with a student that he wanted to make talk in the classroom. And I also pride myself of being able to have people contribute in the classroom. The older I'm getting, the more experience I'm getting, the more careful I am maybe approaching people, but still I feel it's working. But there is an emotional component. You can frustrate people quite easily by approaching them directly, and that's something that needs to be considered. Then in the literature, what you frequently find is a reduction to, well, either national culture dimensions of the Hofstede style, or kind of East-West dichotomies. And this is what I find stunning, even in the more recent literature, 2022, 2023, that we still use that kind of dichotomy East-West, which I think is a very much an oversimplification. You have a lot of diversity in the whatever the West is, whatever the East is, and that's what I don't really find helpful. Those were kind of a couple of issues that come up in the literature and in research. Well, what are kind of mitigating strategies which we can use? And there's a few practical points which are derived from the literature and which I can support on the basis of my own personal experience. It's quite important to intervene early. That sounds a bit kind of superficial in the end, but it's something which is very, very practical. So literally when you enter a kind of a multicultural classroom, especially with kind of new people, it's important to understand relatively early on in the process what kind of people you have in front of you, how they connect to you, how you kind of relate to them, and what their cultural configuration in a sense is, what their patterned ways of thinking, feeling, reacting are. When it comes to cross-cultural differences, it's then quite important to be able to translate certain practices that you are using, that I am using, into the kind of the language, into the words, into how other students or students from other cultures would understand that. And that requires at the meta level quite a lot of consideration and thinking. Then you need to kind of also think about pedagogical tools which are culturally responsive. So you need to understand how students are actually ticking, what makes them tick, what kind of frames of reference they have. And this is kind of now relating back also to what colleagues were saying previously. It's like being able to literally put yourself in the position of those students. And I give you an illustration which was an eye-opener to me. So I've been teaching international business strategy literally on 5 continents over the past 10 years. And that relates a bit to the previous discussions about decolonization and the Anglo-Saxon bias in international business, especially in international business strategy. And I was kind of presenting in the classroom the kind of the usual analytical frameworks that you find in the British or American kind of textbooks. And then at the end of the first day of the workshop, a mature student in his 50s from India, but who has kind of worked in Dubai for 30 years, took me aside and showed me a book, International Business Strategy, written by one of the strategy gurus in India, one of the top business schools in India. And I looked at the book and I read it overnight, and it had the same kind of topic chapters, but the content was completely different frames of references, completely different ways of thinking, completely different philosophical approach. And to me, that was quite an eye-opener, that, well, moving back to the learning about others, that this is actually quite important. But it's also kind of something which can be very, very interesting, but on the other hand, is also something which takes a lot of time, openness and willingness to engage with other people's kind of thinking. And this is actually where I would like to conclude.
Okay, Stefan. That's actually a very good segue for me to go over to Miguel, because what I was going to ask Miguel is how to use collaborative online international learning techniques for students, to enable students to make connections who may not be able to travel. So it is difficult enough to do this in person in a classroom, but then how do you go about it in an online environment?
Thank you very much, man. Yes, I'm continuing talking about this intercultural exchanges or experiences, and also these stereotypes. You know, this collaborative online international learning techniques, or collaborative online international learning methods, programs, are quite popular, I think, nowadays. And even though there is not too much evidence in terms of research about the cross-cultural development skills that we could have, right? Actually, but there's a bunch of methods of different approaches to COIL, to this collaborative online international learning ways. So I think in terms of responsible management, this kind of programs have a lot of opportunity in 2 ways. The first one is about the content, of course. I mean, we can include responsible management education in the content because it's quite transversal for different topics and fields. But perhaps the most important thing about this collaborative online international learning techniques is that they could include responsible management within the very same structure of the programs. as you were saying, and as all you were saying, when we get together two different groups of students, they have to deal with each other in terms of these different groups for different nationalities, different cultures, different this kind of intercultural experience, and not only intercultural experience, but also multi-stereotype clash, right? So that's very interesting from the standpoint of the students, since they have the opportunity to get together and to live, to live this experience of having different stereotypes and biases and perspectives. And as I was saying before, it's very interesting to see how different two different countries that supposed to be close or geographically close, and they even talk the same language, actually they are very different in the ways they can perceive business and how they can take decisions. So these techniques, these COIL programs, are actually developing some specific skills in students, such as I don't know, diversity, inclusion, or empathy, collaboration, collaborative skills, solidarity. So it's that this kind of skills are basically declared by different organizational agencies that are the skills that students need to go after the SDGs achievement. So it's quite relevant to be aware of what this kind of techniques could help us to develop within the classroom with students. I mean, not only in terms of the developing the content, but also in terms of developing strategic skills for the future. And my second thought about this, it's in terms of the benefits. I mean, what lies beyond the COIL? This collaborative online international learning. And we all know that we are constantly using COIL in different ways with different countries, with different institutions. But actually, it's, as you were saying, Noemi, it's like giving the opportunity for students that couldn't afford an international travel, right? It's like the democratization of the internationalization in business schools or in higher education, most precisely. So it gives us the opportunity to democratize the access to the internationalization skills, but also it help us to incorporate interdisciplinary work. For instance, I mean, we can usually it's common when some educators are looking for COIL partners, you know, for partners, these partners in another institutions or in another countries. They usually look for the same topic or some kind of related topics. So, I mean, if I'm teaching logistics, okay, we can search for someone who is teaching supply chain management or operations or something like that, you know. But actually, the richness of COIL and the most interesting thing of COIL programs is that they give us the opportunity to bring together two different fields, and that's an advantage that we can take. So we can get together different fields, different disciplines, and create some kind of, I mean, even if it could be shorter, but it's, I mean, 4 or 5 or 6 weeks for an interdisciplinary program. I mean, that could be very, very valuable for the students. And I don't know, just to talk about a little bit about the curriculum and the internationalization requirements for higher education. You know, recent studies are quite interesting in terms of how students are choosing their next location for these international exchanges, international travels, right? And actually, COIL is like a precedent for those decisions. Which means that students are actually choosing their next locations for traveling according to their previous COIL experiences, because they want to meet their peers, their colleagues. I mean, they get to get friends with these students from the other university, but in an online experience. Now they want to meet them in person. That's quite interesting for us in terms, and also it's quite interesting for managers that in higher education, right? And the efforts that they could do to promote COIL programs. Thank you, Nani.
Thank you very much. And we still have 15 minutes for open discussions. Any questions or comments from the audience? Yes, Rob?
Yeah, oh, yes, I'm unmuted. Miguel, I was looking at the website also of the COIL program, and I like it. You might know that I'm very much into collaborative research, but also collaborative efforts. And so we have this whole network of collaborative researchers on how to work together. So I saw a number of topics also in your approach that I like. It's about trust building, for instance, and the like. But I'm not that clear about the formula that you use. For instance, I would say if there's a common problem, then we can try to figure out how we can create a collaborative approach to this. Is that part of your approach in the COIL network? And my second question would be, what is the function of the moderators? You have two moderators, I suppose they are at your institute. How does it work in practice? Because I'm really interested to see how we can make that work.
Sure, Rob. Thank you so much. Yes, that's a very good questions. In terms of the content, actually, it's quite free. I mean, when you design a COIL project, it's about a problem for sure that you assigned to the students to solve, to the both groups of students. But perhaps the most interesting thing about COIL is that you create these teamworks, these groups of the students, I mean, internationally. I mean, you cross the two groups of the students. So they need to create some kind of solution for the problem. I mean, working with these international groups, within these international groups.
Okay.
And of course, the format of the program could be very diverse. I mean, the traditional one is that you can create a task or a project or a problem, frame a problem and give it to the students for them to solve. But I was involved in another COIL projects that, for instance, one group for one country have the task to be the consultancy group for the other one, and the other one is the investors, the people who the businessmen who want to invest in the focal country. And these guys of the focal country are like consultants in terms of what are the advantages and the constraints in the context and in the business environment to create an investment there.
Okay.
So, I mean, in terms of the format, it's quite free, and the imagination is the limit, I think.
It would be interesting to link it to the SDGs a little bit more explicit. For instance, one remark I wanted to make in following some of the discussions, also in terms also of how we have biases and stereotypes and the like. I said, well, do you realize that's what I'm doing in class? That all the 193 countries in the world have subscribed to the SDGs. Well, big deal, UN, whatever, bureaucracy. So, well, for instance, and then I refer to now your Arabic context, for instance, matters then. I said, well, do you realize that Saudi Arabia also subscribed to SDG 5, gender equality? What does that mean actually in terms of that cultural or biases or whatever? Or the human rights provisions in the SDG framework, which is universal. What is it in China? What is a human right? Is it a personal human right or a group right? Now, the thing is, by addressing the SDGs as a sort of positive change approach from a common goal, and then going backcasting into what you're actually looking at, the problems that you face, then the SDG framework really helps a lot. So anyway, it's just getting the problem in the room and then actually respecting that even Saudi Arabia subscribed to gender equality, but it probably means something different than what I would think. But it creates a call it a platform for discussion, and then also to look at creative collaborative solutions, because one way or another, we collaborate also with the people in Saudi Arabia on gender equality, I suppose. Anyway, that's the challenge.
Thank you, Rob. Miguel, can I please ask you to pop the link to some of these programs into the chat? There was a question about it. Thank you.
I will.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience? Otherwise, I have one question to Swati. No questions. Swati, in a previous conversation, we have been talking about the changing motivations of students and how educators need to take that into consideration. And I think this topic is very fitting when we are talking about the inclusive classroom. So if you could elaborate a bit more about that.
Oh, Noemi. So coming from two different perspectives, the university that I was previously at and was at for a number of years, they built let me retract. The university that I was at largely prided itself in attracting students from the indigenous communities in New Zealand, and also showcasing that university education or higher education is not a matter of privilege, but it is a right for everyone. And that was the fundamental philosophy that the university has operated on for a number of decades. As a result of that, a lot of the student cohort that we saw, especially in the Bachelors of Commerce or Bachelors of Business, were students that were first in family, that represented a large part of the Maori, which is the native population in New Zealand, as well as Pacifica. Now, Pacifica is not a native population in New Zealand, but they do make up the largest number of migrants in New Zealand. And so having similarities or having cultural, similarities between the two communities, it was quite easy to identify why some of the students actually, when they enroll in university, why they have the highest number of dropouts from those communities. And that basically, and I was a part of that investigative team that was tasked by the dean of the business school quite a few years ago now, was to identify whether cultural aspects or family backgrounds had any role to play in the student success of these community groups in particular. So why did they actually choose to come to university? What was the background, as in what was their family background? What was the role of culture or family in particular, or societal, hold on many of these students, and to what an extent that encouraged or discouraged these students from carrying on with their education beyond the first semester or beyond the first year of them being at university. And we worked on this project. It's still ongoing at the university now. But till the time I was there, it basically came down to understanding some of the nuances that some of the other students say. If I was to split a typical classroom, 60% of the student cohort was representative of all the other groups in New Zealand. So New Zealanders coming from not only just born New Zealanders, but also from different ethnicities that call New Zealand home. And then 40% of the students in that same classroom came from either Maori or Pacifica backgrounds. And what was really interesting is when you dug deeper in terms of student retention or student success, what was really interesting is that students that came from these particular communities, family and family responsibilities were huge for these students. In other words, many of the students had to put study on the back burner in many instances, and this became really apparent during and after COVID for unfortunate reasons, that many of these students actually had to give up on their studies or had to put their studies on hold simply because they could help their family or help their parents put food on the table. And that became a real, say, not only issue for a lot of our programs across the board, but also from an education perspective, it became we started looking at ways in which we can address and support these students better. And one of the say policies that we came up internally as a result of that was to provide extra support. So not only provide extra academic support, but also provide extra resource support. Say, for instance, having one laptop between 5 or 6 people within a family, as an example. So the university started providing them support by giving students their individual laptops, which they could borrow from the library, as an example, for a week or two, especially around assessment time, where they didn't have that capability to complete their work outside the university. We also invested quite heavily in providing dedicated staff that was going to help these students get from A to Z. In other words, help them complete their degree. So there were a lot of provisions and policies that were changed internally within the business school to make things happen on the ground for those students. Yeah. Sorry, I think Noemi is frozen. Have we lost her?
We lost Noemi.
Oh, okay.
May I take the liberty to respond then without being invited by Noemi? I'm Swati. No, that's very interesting.
Absolutely.
What you report, it just resonates in a particular way with me, that what you describe as the impact of privilege and kind of social background, for me, it's not so much ethnic background. I mean, there may be kind of intersection issues in the background. Just a brief report on what was published last week about kind of higher education in Germany. It was about literally the social background of German students. And there we have a similar idea. I don't know about the specific institutional setting in New Zealand, but it sounded like education is considered, higher education is considered a public good, where the government has an interest in actually supporting that, in contrast to other countries where it's kind of more commercial activity or other kind of higher education settings. So in Germany, we have the same approach. And a report that came out last week identified that still today, of students young kind of not children, like young adults up to the age of 25, only 1 out of 100, about 20 out of 100 with kind of working class background take up academic programs, as compared to about 80 where one of the 2 parents has actually an academic background. And we're talking about 2023 data. That's not kind of 70s, 60s, which is quite intriguing. And it's even kind of becoming more kind of interesting when you look at the uptake of PhD. So in Germany, of people with other families without any parent with academic background, only 1 in 100 do a PhD, and about 25 of parents with either mother or father having academic background do a PhD, which shows the kind of the differences that you have. And I think you have the same in Brazil, in Latin America, with particular strata of society. You have the same in Northern America, Africa. And this is kind of another thing that one really needs to consider when talking about multicultural classroom, where the people are actually coming from and what kind of setting you have.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just to add to your point, Stefan, if I may, in New Zealand, of course, New Zealand's again a melting pot of cultures where different ethnicities represent and call New Zealand home. But with Maori and Pacifica, the government has a lot of focus around supporting those communities, because these communities tend to be underrepresented in a large part, or large different facets of society, whether you're talking about the workforce in general, or whether you're talking about access to higher education, better healthcare, etc. And so a lot of resources and investments are made specifically in the higher education space in New Zealand, specifically to target these students, to uplift those communities, and provide those students with opportunities that perhaps their family members prior did not have. So that's a very targeted approach that the New Zealand government and the higher education system has, at least in the country. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sati. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. I would like to thank all the speakers and the audience for this amazing debate. And I wish we had another hour to continue. Stefan, do you have a closing remark? Your hand is up. No.
Sorry, no, that was just an accident. A lot of food for thought. It's been very, very intriguing session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And good night and have a good day.
Thank you,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
And I'd love to
Bye-bye.
connect
Bye-bye.
with Stefan
Bye-bye.
and Michael offline, of course, but I'll definitely be in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. Likewise.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See ya. Bye.